Erica Grieder, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so we're here to talk about your book, but also what's going on in the Texas legislature. But let's start by talking about what we might loosely call the Texas model, which is sort of one of the things the book is about. You seem to see it rooted in kind of cultural and historical experience in the state, but also it has a big kind of policy piece. So why don't we start by you telling us how you frame the Texas model? How are you explaining this to the rest of the country?
Okay, sure. Well, you can describe it really simply just as low taxes, low services. It's a small state system. If you want to expand on that, as Governor Perry sometimes does, you can say light regulations and tort reform. I never really get tort reform. That seems like a smaller part of the model to me, but he's the governor, so that's what he says. But that's the model the state's effectively had for its entire history as a state, and before that when it was a country, occasionally out of necessity, like no money in the state, so no way to have government money, therefore no spending. But over time it's become, I think, the basic approach for the state, and I think that Democrats in the state don't support it as strongly as Republicans do, but are closer to that model than their national counterparts would be.
So part of the subtitle of the book is What America Can Learn from the Strange Genius of Texas. Is that what you mean by the strange genius? If so, disaggregate the genius and the strange part for me.
I think we just put strange because if you're talking about Texas doing anything right, you have to say strange to sound credible to an outside audience. But no, I don't think that's I think it's an approach that's worked for Texas. I think that in some ways it's the United States' approach relative to, for example, a rich democracy in Western Europe. And they often look at us as the US looks at Texas, or have some of the same beliefs about what we're like. I think that other states could use the model. Some states might not prefer it, and it might not be good for them. It's kind of a model that, to my mind, emphasizes accessibility, openness, and growth. So for a state like us, which has been a state with a lot of population growth decade on decade, with a lot of need for economic growth, it's been a model that's worked for us.
Now, part of that has to do with the population growth helps in conjunction with the regime keep labor costs down, right?
Sorry, what?
Low labor costs is part of the growth model there, right? In terms of population growth and how the model works.
Well, I think it's been part of it historically. Certainly, that was true of the entire South for a lot of the 20th century. That cheap labor was part of why you'd come here. It's less true in Texas today than it has been in the past because the state's been catching up, and because we're now a state where, although you can find pockets of regional variation where there is a lot of low-wage labor, and in fact too much minimum wage labor, the state as a whole has almost the same per capita personal income and household income as the national average.
You mentioned regional variation, and another part of the title of the book is big. As you go out, you've been on a national tour. It sounds like you were opening for the Black Crowes or something, but you've been talking about the book to the national media a lot in the last couple of weeks. How much do you find you have to flatten out the internal variation of the state to give, sort of the quick explanation of the book?
It's been a balancing act. I think that it's something, when I'm in Texas talking to a Texas audience, we have more room to go into detail because people know the state differently than the national audience. And occasionally the national questions are really, really top-line questions, like people still think it's just oil derricks in everyone's backyard and cowboys roaming around, which is not true. People think it's mostly rural, which is not true. We're about 80% urbanized as far as population. So it's been, I've tended to defer to the kind of top line explanation and then get into detail if somebody asks.
I want to come back to that in a different kind of way, but I want to ask about the other piece then. Talk to me about the kind of cultural part of the argument and how part of what it seems to me you're explaining in the book, and actually you spend a decent amount of time doing this, are the cultural and historical roots of contemporary Texas. What led you to pose it that way and unpack that a little bit for me? How does that work?
Sure. Well, I guess I'd start by saying that we think about what's unique about Texas in largely cultural terms. That this is a state where you believe in bootstraps and you believe in independence and self-reliance and community spirit and neighborliness and so on. And I think that's true. I think it's a big component of it. I don't think it's only cultural. I think that there's a pretty extensive constitutional and legal structure underlying that. And I think, in fact, part of why you see the state having the model it has today is because we had certain laws when we joined the Union, which is not true of a lot of states because we were a country before. And then because we have a constitution that effectively establishes this kind of model as the framework for what the state government can and mostly can't do. But then beyond that, you have this cultural dimension to it. Culture, of course, is just a collection of ideas, right? And it's the habits and norms and assumptions about how society should work that we see in Texas, which occasionally doesn't map onto national norms or is a little bit striking from a national perspective. So something that we're used to in Texas, for example, is this sort of default obsession with business and the economy in every context. So if you're talking about higher education, talking about the arts, you phrase that first as, we support the University of Texas because it is an important part of our economic development. It attracts investment and research and jobs. If you're doing the arts, you say the arts contribute $6 billion a year to the state economy, therefore we support the arts. There's not these more nebulous appeals to values that you might see elsewhere.
But there are some other kind of value-laden things that are shot through. I mean, you talk a bit about individualism. I mean, do you still think, and the kind of frontier mentality, et cetera, do you think that's ultimately kind of about this economic kind of business orientation? Is there a...
There's a connection for sure, and I think the connection, the way I see it in the book, I borrow a heuristic that actually came from Scandinavia. Can I use that here?
I think so.
Oh, great. Okay, so there's this paper that came out.
We'll bleep it out. We'll bleep out where you said Scandinavia if we need to.
This whole section. But so basically, a couple of years ago, the Scandinavian governments put out a paper for Davos saying, here's the Nordic model of capitalism, here's why it works. And they gave this triangle that had the government at one axis, the individual at the second, and then the family in the third. And they say basically, in Scandinavia, you see a strong government-individual alliance. So they're not opposed to the family, but the idea is that if the individual can turn to the government for things like wage support, childcare subsidies, you have a situation where women don't depend on husbands for financial support, kids don't depend on parents if their parents aren't making a good salary, and the role of the family is somewhat diminished there. And by contrast, they say in Germany, for example, you have a strong government-family alliance, and there's less focus on being an individual in Germany, but there's a pretty strong relationship where the government will try to offset the effects of layoffs or of economic distress by paying for workers to stay employed, at least part-time. And then in the US, it's an individual family alliance, not contra the government, but we see family, or as I would say, and I say in the book, if you construe that third category more broadly to include churches, NGOs, civil society, and especially business, which has been the big one in Texas, then you see an alliance of these two things, the individual drawing support from outside actors, not contra the government, but with less tendency to refer to the government for solutions.
The way you pose that leads me to want to ask you about another theme in the book. I mean, there's this tension in the book that seems to me to be kind of, in some ways, driving it between outside, the sort of American perception of Texas, and then what Texas sort of, what you're trying to say is really going on to some extent. Talk about this, and you say at one point in the book, and I'm paraphrasing, that the Texans are sort of super Americans, I think.
Yeah, and I think that phrase has been used before.
Yeah.
It was maybe coined in the 50s by
this famous article.
The New Yorker,
right.
Yeah. And so you might see Texas as having an exaggerated set of the U.S. traits, the focus on self-reliance, the ideation of entrepreneurs, the idea that we're going to look after ourselves and take care of ourselves, maybe take care of our neighbors when they're in need, but we're not going to turn to the government. And I think that has, it's a simplistic account of what the U.S. is like, but it's, you can say, broadly true compared to other models that we see in other countries. But what's interesting about Texas right now, well, I guess there's a lot of interesting things about Texas right now, but one thing that's interesting is that in recent years we've seen the federal government seem to take a different course with things like the Affordable Care Act to assert a bigger role for itself. And Texas has been more distinctly counter that trend. And it's been having, obviously, a parallel or the contrary economic experience to a lot of states in the country during that span.
How much of that, though, is political? Because, from maybe a Scandinavian friend of yours might argue that the Affordable Care Act, in fact, incorporated the private sector in a huge way.
Oh, it was very generous to the private sector. I would agree with that. It gave them a lot of favors, I think.
So in that sense, I mean, it seems like that breaks down a little bit in terms of the Texas response.
But it also,
and the contrast.
it also involves, a mandate or tax, depending on which party you come from, that is new and quite expansive. It's going to involve more government spending. It's conceptually the expansion of an entitlement that we haven't seen before and that we haven't seen since the 60s, really, in its scope and in its effort.
Tell me a little bit about why you sort of, the subjective position when you started to write the book. I mean, what made you want to write the book about Texas? Because it comes off to some degree as somewhere between an explanation and a defense.
Yeah,
and I read something, I think it was the New York Times interview, where you kind of said, well, I'm a Texan.
Well, I think in that interview they asked if you're saying this about Texas because the book talks a lot about the state's weaknesses, are you getting a lot of flack from Texans saying don't talk bad about our state? Which is like, no. I mean, I think that we can all, as Texans, talk about our strengths and our weaknesses candidly and without fear of repercussion from fellow Texans.
I'm not sure about that, but okay.
I've been doing it for years, and it's been fine. It's been fine. I think when I started, I started the book from a position of a lot of cognitive dissonance, which is my usual starting place in life. It was just that I was working for The Economist then, and I was covering the state and the surrounding states. So I'm following the state economy, the regional economy, and doing state and regional politics and economic issues. And what I was reading at that point in the national news was just this litany of distress about unemployment, long-term unemployment, intractable seeming unemployment, housing crisis, financial crisis, and people just seemed to succumb to this feeling of uncertainty, anxiety, depression. I mean, it was a downturn, and so people were also depressed. And we were having this alternate universe here where I think we felt the pinch of that, but we didn't feel it to nearly the extent that other states did. And I think given the general perception that we're like the stupidest state possible, which is not fair, it was worth looking at it in a more systematic way.
So you were talking about some of the questions as you've gone to other parts of the country happening at a fairly high level of generality. I mean, how do you think the argument goes over?
In other states?
Yeah.
Well, it depends. It depends on the audience. I mean, I think that I'm not a partisan on either side. I have just genuinely muddled politics. I would say the reception's been warmer on the right than on the left, and the right being somewhat geographically distributed in the United States. But it hasn't been that hostile on the left, and I think some people have been cautiously optimistic about this view of it.
If you were to look at it through a partisan lens, can you see the sense of that this that the approach to political economy in Texas, if you will, is kind of an alternate model, isn't it?
It's an alternate model to what a lot of progressives would describe. And so occasionally I find that if I'm talking to a progressive friend, I'm going a few rounds. So for example, on Medicaid, for me, if the goal is to maximize the well-being and public health of a people, then I'm not sure Medicaid is the best way to achieve that. Because we know from this state, where we've been doing an ad hoc sort of experiment with not insuring people, we don't have health outcomes that are as bad as that would suggest. So we rank maybe 40th for public health, according to the United Health Foundation's last rankings, but 25th for health outcomes. And if you look at kind of drill down on what the health problems are in the state, it's things like sedentary lifestyle, obesity, type 2 diabetes, things that are correlates of poverty, of behavior, and of geography if you're in a rural area or if you don't have access to fresh food. So I think from that point of view, if those are problems that are not going to be well addressed by the expansion of Medicaid, it's maybe a false choice to say we should allocate that money somewhere else. But I think that's the kind of thinking that I'm doing, at least. And I think when I put it in those terms after a couple of rounds, I don't get harmony on this, but I can at least get some goodwill that I'm not just out to
hurt poor people.
Yeah, which is I think the initial response sometimes.
I want to talk a little bit about, I was struck, and I don't want to get too far in the weeds here because the book just came out, but I was interested in the thinking behind the chapter you called the vestigial parts, which basically talks about, you talk about sort of Texas moving forward, becoming more urbanized, the sense of the state, perhaps being more modern than stereotypes of the state. Mm-hmm. And then kind of the next chapter say, well, but there is some of this other stuff kind of still laying around.
Well, yeah.
And you talk about the death penalty, and you talk about guns, and you talk about, you go back to business again, but kind of almost, you don't use the word, I don't think, but almost from like a cronyism, business government intersection perspective. Talk about the need to do that.
Well, I think it was part of my. I think if you're going to be fair as a journalist or as a observer of something, you really have to know the critiques and give those critiques with as much candor and fullness as you can, not just as a matter of integrity, which it is, but also as a matter of tactics, right? That you want to know the other side's critique as well as they do and figure out whether it's fair or not. And from my point of view as a citizen, I'm not afraid for us to think about things that we're not doing well. If we don't specify the problems and describe them and look at them, we're not going to be able to address them, right? So in both of those roles, as a journalist, as a Texan, I wanted to be, as fully candid and take the time it took to describe some of these problems.
One of the things that's interesting, another thing that's interesting to me about the book is that you do, it seems to me, try to take head on the centrality of business in the model. You made a reference to it again a little while ago. By way of transition, I want to talk about the legislature a little bit. Where do you see that, sort of right now? Do you see that as kind of one of the most stable factors in the state? Is it changing?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've given this a lot of thought. I mean, of course, I was with The Economist for a long time, and maybe it's because that makes you think very economics-ishly, like you're hammer everything's a nail. But it does seem like if you're thinking about business as an agent in society, there are certain advantages it has. I wouldn't call them virtues. I don't think they're normative, but I think you can say, okay, business, it's designed to do certain things, designed to exist sustainably, to make money, and there's a kind of transparency that you can derive from, here's what they're trying to do. And then, depending on the nature of the business, there's certain things they're going to need. They're going to need roads, they're going to need water, they're going to need an educated workforce. And in that sense, the private sector has those demands, and it's going to take those demands to the legislature. And the legislature has generally been quite receptive in Texas to talking with lobbyists and occasionally talking with them at great length and very seriously. So we've seen this kind of phenomenon in Texas where on a lot of issues, it's often been the business community that's been leaning into a problem, like Sheryl Sandberg, I guess, and saying we need to have a sales tax, we need to pay for roads, we need to pay for schools, we need to have more schools. And I think they, in some ways, are even more active in doing that than the constituents of Texas.
Well, let's talk about that. That's obviously the segue into the current session.
Sure.
I mean, you've been traveling around, you've been following this for a while, you've talked to a lot of folks. Is what we're seeing now, I mean, one has argued that, we're seeing kind of a return of a kind of developmentalist impulse in this session, right?
Well, I think so, and it's partly because of the budget outlook. So we're a state where the policies always followed the budget. It kind of has to because of all the spending provisions that are built into the state constitution. So we can't spend more than the comptroller guesses we're going to have, and it's often a guess with the current comptroller. You can't spend more than the projected rate of economic growth from the last budget over the biennium that you're looking at now. So when you get a big budget number like we did this session, then suddenly you have a lot more room to run. And then the wish list of things that people had wanted to do that weren't even really on the table starts coming out. Big, large-scale projects and infrastructure are talked about, but then also things like mental health funding, where we've always been one of the worst states and where we're now, I think, going to restore or put in about $200 million. Right.
Expand a little on you commented in the lead up to that about, that sometimes the business folks are more attendant to those infrastructure priorities than, I think you called them constituents. Yes,
I mean, voters, citizens. And that sounds like a pretty harsh thing to say about voters, but I think the thing is, if you're a person, you're localized in your time and place, right? So you might know what congestion's like in your city, you know what the school's like for your kid, you know what the water quality is in the town you live in, you know how Lake Travis looks when you drive by, but you're not allocating the time. It's not your job to have the kind of macro sense of what all the state's water situation is and what it's going to be 20 or 30 years from now. and you're, I think, somewhat driven by the demands of your job, your life, year on year, month to month, and so on. Whereas the business community, given that they have the overarching goal of being profitable 20, 30, 40 years from now, 100 years from now, has to be thinking about 50 years from now, if we don't have water, is this plant being built here going to be a good idea? Or should we be doing LNG export or import with this terminal, or should we be investing in something else entirely? So I think it's kind of a time horizon difference that emerges.
Do you think it's only money that's driven the change this time?
No, I think the other side of it is that in 2011, we of course had a very different situation for a couple of reasons. The ledge was very, very heavily controlled by Republicans. It still is, but slightly less. And the budget outlook was different. It was much worse. We had a huge shortfall, about $27 billion, depending on which projections you were working with about school enrollment and so on. So you had a very conservative legislature that had been kind of unchallenged by Democrats for a long time. And it was at the point where the only challenge to the Republicans was coming from within the party, from the Tea Party, rather than from outside from a second party. And then you had these conditions, the budget conditions that favored a very draconian approach anyway. So they went really far with that. And I think this time around, they might have some sense of, the Republicans might have some sense of, okay, we went pretty far that time. If we keep doing that, we're going to take this to its logical conclusion and its extreme, and that's not going to be popular.
Well, what's your sense of do you have a sense of what the internal mechanisms of that are? Because it seems to me there's a little bit of a disjuncture there between, what's quote unquote popular and the tale of there being different constituencies in the party having more or less leverage at different times.
Well, I can give you a descriptive account of it. I think what happened was that a lot of people circa 2011 were worried about 2012 primaries. We're worried about facing a primary funded by Michael Quinn Sullivan, who's that Empower Texans PAC person. So I think that was the concern. That was who they were likely to be challenged by. Something similar is happening right now, maybe with John Cornyn in the Senate. He's running for re-election in 2014. Democrats, I think, have nobody who's said they want to run. So his most likely challenge is going to be from the right, possibly from Tea Party-backed people. But I think what we saw in 2012 was a lot of those primary challenges didn't work. Specifically, the biggest one to Speaker Joe Straus didn't work. I mean, he won that primary easily and came back in the ledge, and there was a lot of discussion about, well, Joe Straus is so moderate, we're going to make sure he's not the speaker, we're going to find our own speaker from the Tea Party group. And it just totally drizzled out. I mean, he didn't even have a challenge. He was reelected as speaker with acclaim, and he's been running a pretty good session, I think. He's been one of the strongest legislators in the ledge this session, the strongest. So I think that seeing some Republicans face that challenge and win might be instructive to other Republicans, too, who had worried about facing that challenge themselves.
Well, to some degree, Straus went in a better position than all of the other two major leaders in the state.
That's true, because you had Dewhurst having lost that very difficult and personally probably very challenging primary with Ted Cruz, and Perry having had that sort of, catastrophically brief and not very successful presidential campaign. So they were both a little bit on the back foot.
Well, then let's talk a little bit about, well, actually, before I move on to politics, I want to come back to some of that too. But so what else are you seeing? I mean, what's your sense of the end game in the session as we sit here on May 2nd? The water thing has stuttered a little bit, but doesn't seem on, like it's gone completely dry. But
what was, so to speak, what was that quote from Ritter? "A doorknob dead is the bill." It's funny because all session we've been watching, and it's actually been kind of boring, I think, for journalists because they've been mostly pretty peaceful in both chambers. So that's been distressing, obviously, for me personally. But just recently, you thought they were going to have this pretty bipartisan and relatively harmonious session. But I was in Fort Worth 2 days ago, and I was at a lunchtime talk, and I was talking about, well, we need to invest in water, but I think we're going to. The House is taking up the bill, and they're going to invest $2 billion in water. And I get out and check the news, and it's like, oh, apparently we're not because of some parliamentary procedure. And Democrats helped kill that one too, for whatever reason. So we'll see some of these fights start to emerge. I hope we do water this time. I think I think that some other reforms that are pending, I would like to see succeed. The payday lending reforms, I think, are important. I think that to me is part of a bigger issue where, although we're now as a state doing pretty well as far as income, broadly speaking, aggregate median numbers, we're not doing as well on wealth. So we still have a lot of unbanked, underbanked low household wealth levels, lack of savings, lack of access to credit. And I think that should be the kind of focus that we can take up now that we've come out of the worst sort of economic conditions, or the worst economic conditions we used to be in.
But that bill's in trouble too.
Yeah, it is in trouble. So I mean, these are some things that are in trouble.
Okay, well, you didn't mention education, so talk to me about where education is, and just in this interest of fairness, I mean, I think what Sylvester Turner would tell you is they killed the bill because they're trying to make a point about education funding.
Yeah, I don't know how I feel about making political points about education funding if the cost is funding the water plan that we should have funded years ago. But that would be Turner's argument. I think that Democrats have been very frustrated because there were about $5.4 billion in cuts to education in 2011, which were in some sense accidental cuts, because when we started this session, we had a surplus of $8 billion, more than $8 billion. So if you knew in 2011 that you were going to have a surplus of $8 billion, you don't need to cut $5 billion from schools.
The comptroller's not going to send you a Christmas card this year.
Well, she shouldn't, because I would send it back. But and to be fair to the comptroller too, actually, I mean, we always say it's difficult budgeting, projecting a budget in the state. You're trying to project a budget over about 2.5 years in the future, based on sales tax receipts largely. That's more than half of our general revenue comes from sales taxes, and those are mutable. Plus, you're doing it only once in each cycle. Most states come back in the off years if they have a biennial session just to fix the budget, because like what happened last time, as soon as the projections were made and the session ended and the budget was written that cut all this funding for everything, within months you saw receipts come back in, money start to come back in, oil and gas revenue come back in. So you could have known 2 years in advance that we were going to have some kind of surplus, or at least a better outlook. But we didn't have any means to do anything about it because they didn't call a special session and we had no regular recurring budget session. So I think with schools, I mean, that's been the sore point for Democrats all along. Because of the school finance lawsuits that are pending, it's been a little bit difficult to say what will happen, because I think on both sides there's some knowledge that whatever they do right now is going to be affected by the decision coming down later this year, maybe even next year, about what they have to spend. So
it makes sense for them to wait, which is the conventional, which is sort of the conventional wisdom right now.
I think they'll restore funding. I think they should probably restore all the funding. And the thing is, too, it's with their schools, we should restore per capita funding to the level the state had previously said was appropriate for spending. And we should also be aware that every year in a state growing this much, we're adding more kids to the schools, and we're disproportionately young. That's going to mean more funding because you have more students going in, but also it's going to mean things like new schools in some places, and new administration, and new counselors and new teachers. So I think that they should at least restore it, but we'll see how it goes.
You've talked about you just talked about the sort of the how infrequently the budget estimates are produced. You talked about the time frames here. And you also talked about the institutional sort of supports for, our strange genius. Do you think we've outgrown the biennial legislature? I mean, would it be worthwhile to revisit some of those in your kind of macro level view? The institutional arrangements that have been in place that kind of drive a lot of what you're talking about?
I guess I would say I would do other things first. I think I would do an annual budget session. If you want to run a lean budget, I think that's fine. I think it's worked out pretty well for us, but it's probably in the management books, like the Six Sigma books. I haven't read these books, but I think they say you've got to, keep a close eye on your inventory and your finances. So we should be doing that, I think, just for maximal efficiency. I think we should maybe think about certain new revenue streams, not new income tax. I think that's a bridge too far, and I don't think we need it, actually. I think if we look at restructuring the margins tax so it brings in the money it was supposed to bring in the first place, we would be able to address that structural deficit that's currently in the state budget. I'm not opposed to thinking about new revenue streams related to the consumption that the revenue would support. So things like a higher gas tax or vehicle registration fees being higher. I'm also for a soda tax, like Bloomberg. Not a ban like Bloomberg, but I'm for a soda tax.
So really, you're a tax and spend.
I'd like to. I'm a nanny state tax and spend person. I'd like to raise the soda tax or have a soda tax. I think that kind of thing is, it's a consumption tax. Those are regressive, but it's not on a necessity, and it's a product in question that, while not a vice, contributes to problems we have like childhood obesity and poor nutrition. So I think if we can offset consumption while bringing in some revenue, I'd be okay with that.
It's right up on the edge of a sin tax.
It's like the child sin soda.
I'm not getting anywhere near there. Okay, I want to talk a little bit. Well, I want to talk about electoral politics. We were just made, we sort of alluded to the big three and how they went into this session. That is Dewhurst, Strauss, Perry. Handicap the 2014 governor's race. What do you think? Who's going to run? Who's not going to run? What does it look like? Who should run?
I predict Perry's not going to run for re-election. He already was the longest-serving governor of the state in 2010 when he was last re-elected. If he wants to run for president again, which I think he might, there's really no advantage to being governor at the time you run. And in fact, it's probably better to step down in 2014 so you can focus on preparation for that race. I think that means Attorney General Greg Abbott will run for governor. On the Republican side, almost certainly win. He has a lot of money already raised. And I think on the Democratic side, the name we keep hearing is Wendy Davis, the state senator from Fort Worth. She drew a 2-year term at the beginning of the session, meaning she has to run for re-election for something anyway. Her county is one of the few sort of purplish counties. It's Tarrant County, her district, and so she's already, I mean, that means two things, right? She's already fought a competitive election and won a couple times in the state, and she would have to win a contested, competitive election in 2014 no matter what she does, so might as well go statewide. Of the two, I think the landscape still favors Abbott. And then the rest of the ticket, we've seen a few sort of traffic jams for the Republican primaries. On the Democratic side, really nobody, really nothing yet. Everyone's seems to be waiting for 2018 when they magically produce a full suite of candidates who all win at once.
I'm not sure I've heard that, but okay.
I think that's their tacit strategy. I mean.
Okay. You seem skeptical of even 2018. I mean, I hate getting asked this question, but I'm asking questions today,
It's
so
occupational hazard, yeah.
So I'll ask you instead. So what are the prospects for the Democrats winning statewide? What do you make of that?
Well, I don't mean to be as uncharitable towards them. I guess I get a little frustrated because we hear all this about Texas turning blue and battleground Texas and all these initiatives, and it's like, I mean, it just feels a little bit silly when there's not candidates running in 2014 for offices that they should be running for if they want to win them eventually. I think some Democrats in the state who are on the bench for statewide office are really doing a good job of building a record of accomplishment. Mayor Castro from San Antonio, I think, is genuinely doing a lot with the city and has kind of proven a capacity to not just talk about a reform that he would like to see, like pre-K for all the city's kids, but to actually take that case to the voters and to win that case, even when it involves raising a tax on yourselves, which is what happened in San Antonio. So I think that's the kind of approach that will work. Even in that case, I think because the state is so physically large and has so many different parts to it, if you think about it, we have about 22 media markets, 6 of the 20 biggest cities in the country. It's a lot of ground to cover, even just logistically. Like if you're campaigning across the state, it's a lot of hours you're on the road and you're not at your day job. So I think those barriers are real. They also mean a lot of money is going to be involved, probably about $5 or $10 million to win a statewide race. But I think I think there are some Democrats who are working at it and who will be in a stronger position to win statewide.
This has been a very candidate-structured kind of conversation of that. Kind of organizationally and structurally, where are the Democrats in your view?
Well, I guess they're not where they need to be. I think they have geographically they have majority support in all the big cities. I think that's maybe less true in Dallas or Fort Worth than the others, but in all the other big cities, they have majority support in the Rio Grande Valley, which is pretty densely populated. As in most states, the distribution of voters is like red areas or rural areas are red and cities are blue and the exurbs and suburbs are purple. I don't think their grassroots organization is especially strong, except for maybe the handful of areas where they've had active Democratic Party politics because of city elections like Austin and San Antonio. And then as far as statewide finances, they're not where the Republicans are. Although the Republicans have, a little bit of the internal dissension, the kind of fault lines within the Republican Party mean some fractionalization of their organization and their money, I think.
You think that's waxing, waning, the internal divisions in the Republican Party?
I think it's waning. I think that I feel like in some ways, people around the country would look at the state as a state that kind of brought the country into the Tea Party movement, like with that rally on tax day a couple of years ago. And but I think we're also kind of the state that could be bringing the Republican Party back out of it, because what we've seen is that the moderates, when challenged, tend to win. The moderate agenda, I think, is generally carrying the day. I think the Tea Party role in this session has been to kind of thwart some things getting through, but they're not really advancing policy and they're not setting the agenda. They're just, throwing sand in the gears.
Okay, thanks. Questions? Let's get a mic to Dave Edwards, who seemed very eager, I might add.
Well, this is all very interesting, and of course, everybody talks about what's going to happen with the Hispanic vote in coming years and when that might turn the state blue or at least purple or whatever. But nobody seems to talk about what it's going to take to actually get Hispanics to the polls. Could you address your views on that?
Sure. I actually, I think that the kind of interesting area to look at might be El Paso, which is a heavily Hispanic and heavily Democratic city. And it's also part of a great controlled experiment because it borders New Mexico, and New Mexico has recently been considered a swing state in national elections. So if you think about El Paso, Las Cruces, New Mexico, they're in the same media market. Both of them were contested with TV and radio ads in the last national elections because Democrats were trying to campaign in New Mexico, and some of the ads went over to El Paso. But only New Mexico got door-to-door campaigning and kind of active on-the-ground organization. And what you saw was correspondingly turnout was in fact significantly higher in New Mexico, in Las Cruces, than in El Paso, despite the fact that demographically, age, ethnicity, and partisan identity, they look quite similar. So I think that kind of case suggests that a more active ground organization will help Democratic turnout.
Anything else?
That was, I think, my. No, I mean,
But what's your sense of the Battleground Texas hoo-ha?
Well, I mean, I guess they should have a Battleground Texas initiative if they want to win statewide offices. I don't know how much they're doing right now or how much they've started doing yet, besides announcing that they're here. One thing I'll be interested to watch pretty closely too is with Battleground Texas and with kind of national Democrats hoping to win the state and the state's electoral votes, how well the National Democratic Party's norms map onto Texas's Democratic Party norms. We've seen a bit of that friction, I think, so far between the Texas Democrats and the National Democrats here in Austin. I'm not sure how it'll play out. I think that there's this idea nationally that Democrats are sort of progressive, big government. They're pro-unions, and that's not been the case in Texas, even when the state was a one-party Democratic state. It was still pretty pro-business, and you look at Democrats like LBJ, who was, a fantastically influential Democrat for the state and the country, but was not really a big supporter of unions, for example. So,
and in the areas, I would say that within the areas where the Democrats are strong, those fights in some ways are still going on. They're not as pitched as they were. But I mean, one of the things about El Paso Democratic Party politics is, like a cage match. I mean, you have very close races, very hard-fought races. The place is rife with internal, deeply personal vendettas and mutual dislike. Other question?
Ask a follow-up.
Yeah, sure, and then we'll go to the back.
Well, you haven't said anything about policy possibilities in terms of mobilizing Latinos, but there's this view nationally that Hispanics tend to be kind of bourgeois, or at least wanting to be bourgeois, and that Republicans do a better job of appealing to that side of them, whereas Democrats, in a sense, are talking as if they're never going to advance beyond bread and butter issues and all that. But do you see those sorts of concerns manifesting in the Hispanic communities here in Texas?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, any answer I give is going to be partly speculative because I think this is an area we don't have great exit polling on. We had 2 polls about the Hispanic vote in Texas before the last election, and they had totally opposite results. One of them came from the Base Slice pollsters, and they're conservative leaning, but they had the overall results like correctly pegged the week before the overall Obama-Romney split, and they said there was going to be a very narrow Obama advantage among Hispanic voters in Texas, like 51-48 or something, which was totally not the case in the rest of the country. And the other poll, I think, was Latino Voices, and yeah, and they had the kind of split that we saw nationally in exit polls, like 73% for Obama, 24% for Romney. So looking at that, I felt like we really couldn't say anything about the Hispanic vote in the last election cycle. And we have seen it in Texas that the gap has not been as big between Democrats and Republicans when we've had exit polls as it has been in other states. And I think that's partly because the Republicans, having looked at the demographics of the state and having this, for whatever reason, not having had the same punitive approach on immigration as other Republicans have had in other states, including nearby states, having had this focus on small business and entrepreneurship, which is another thing pollsters tell us is a concern for Hispanic voters. They've had better outcomes with Hispanic voters than national Republicans have. Whether that's changing, I think we can't say because we don't have the polling data for it. So does that answer the question?
Yeah, except for turnout. I mean, what about all the people who don't turn out? Are they not turning out for some reason other than not having?
Well, for a couple of reasons. I mean, a lot of them are young. Hispanic people in Texas are on average younger than Anglos in Texas. Like if you look at the kind of age brackets and ethnicity, it's like kind of 2 inverse V's going this way. We know young voters don't vote at the same rate that older voters do, which is a kind of perennial sore point in American politics. Partly it's due to poverty and education, which are also correlated with voter turnout in the United States and registration. Partly it's geographic. If your Hispanic population is concentrated in certain parts of the state, South Texas, those are areas that haven't had competitive contested elections. So if you know the election result's kind of a foregone conclusion, the Democrat's going to win, the same guy is going to be reelected, I think that naturally reduces voter turnout, not for reasons of apathy or disengagement necessarily. It's just not so suspenseful to vote in an election where the outcome's pretty clear.
Interest. Yeah. In the back.
From your perspective at The Economist and the Texas Monthly, would you say the level of corruption, the culture of corruption during the Perry era is greater, less, or about the same as previous modern Texas eras?
I think I think you could say that the level of cronyism has gotten steadily more concentrated in the Perry administration because he's been there so long. I mean, over time, you just have more time to make these appointments and to do these kinds of deals, right? But what's interesting about it to me, or what's kind of thought-provoking and counterintuitive, and I'm not sure how I feel about it, is the fact that a lot of what we describe as corruption, or what would be described as corruption, is not only not considered corruption in Texas, but is kind of considered good government. So if you go to the ledge and you have somebody who's a legislator / business person, and they're meant to all be that because we have a part-time legislature, they make peanuts, right? So it's kind of, the presumption is you have a job if you're in the ledge. And somebody who works in an industry will say, as an expert in this industry, here's my view on the bill. And it's like, thanks for your informed opinion on this issue that affects your industry directly. It's kind of weird. That's another area where we're not really in step with national traditions. And I think in some cases it's like noticeably egregious. In other cases, it seems like, yeah, actually that is a useful perspective. Thanks for having that. So.
It's over here and then over here.
What would your recommendations be to Governor Brown, Governor Cuomo, in terms of addressing some of the issues that New York and California, Illinois just write off? They're so stupid. But are there things?
Well, I've stopped doing Texas versus California comparisons because I feel like it's kind of piling on at this point.
It's kind of not.
Yeah.
Us versus them,
Mm-hmm.
but one would hope best practices you know, there are
Sure,
things
yeah.
you point out that one would hope would be applicable to other states.
I think derived from the focus the state has on employment and jobs, and you can actually describe the state as, I mean, you can describe it as pro-business, of course, but you can more accurately describe the state as being pro-Texas business, and often that means pro-employment. So I think I would look at a state like New York and say, okay, we have one huge metropole that has almost half of the people living in what the mayor's administration has defined as poverty, and then the other half not living in poverty. In fact, the median home price in Manhattan is like 4.5 times higher than it is in Houston, which is the 4th biggest city in the country. So maybe think about the kind of policies that we in Texas have very little experience with as far as to encourage a more middle class development in that kind of city. But then thinking about the rest of the state, if you're Governor Cuomo, I would think about industry development in a sustainable way, in a way that makes sense for what you project your workforce to be and for what you project your state's future needs to be. So the one that would be, I think, most timely in New York is fracking, because they're currently have a moratorium on fracking for natural gas. They have a lot of gas reserves they could develop, though, and it's very contentious because of concerns over air quality, water quality, and so on, all of which I think are serious and worth considering and worth managing well if fracking is going to be allowed in New York State. But all of which are, to my mind, not as serious as the concerns that arise with coal mining and coal consumption. So that's an area I would suggest they, in particular, look at going forward.
My question is, are we likely to have guns on campus legislation passed by the legislature?
No, I think that one's done this time around. I think that we were not going to have. Well, last time when it didn't get through, I think they thought it would get through because the ledge was so far right that session, and then it eventually kind of fiddled out because people realized it would cost schools more money to have the insurance they'd have to carry as universities to have guns on campus, which is like a very Texas-y plot twist. But this time around, I think that it was filed. There was some kind of discussion about it, but it wasn't quite as enthusiastic. And at this point, it seems to have sputtered out as an effort. And I think on guns, we're not going to further liberalize gun laws in the state at the moment. We're doing that sort of kind of PR stunt of trying to attract gun makers and manufacturers to the state. But if you look at polling data, and actually if you look at Jim and Josh's polling data, you see things like about 80% of Texans either strongly or somewhat support the idea of closing the background checks loophole. If you look at CHL registration around the country, we don't seem to have a very high rate of gun ownership per capita, using CHLs as a proxy for who has guns in a state. So I think that we're not going to see that bill go through, and we're also not going to see a huge gun renaissance in the state or on campus, unless that guy who's printing 3D guns starts distributing them, which is here right now.
Josh in the back.
So looking ahead, how resilient do you think the Texas model is given the demographic shifts, the in-migration, in the next 10, 15, 20 years? I mean, it's a book about culture and history. Is the acculturation process here so strong that we're going to stick with the Texas model, or is this something that's going to sort of slowly dwindle off into something else?
Have people ask a variation of this question a lot, and often it's phrased as, well, if all these Californians are going to move here to try to find jobs, what if they start voting for California ideas, and then we become like California? I think the deculturation factor is real. I mean, it's a self-selecting group of migrants, right, domestic and international, who come here for reasons, not that they love the model so much, therefore they move to where the political philosophy is most aligned with theirs, but they apparently see some value in how things are going in the state. I think that because of the state's growth, and ironically because of the state's success with this model, we've created the need for some tweaks to the model. So some new investment in infrastructure, more universities, more schools, like I was saying before. If you add 4 million people to a state over the course of about 11 years, we're now 26 million. It's about 20% increase. That's a different playing field than it was quite recently. I don't think that means we need to abandon the model or that we're going to even see substantial changes to the general thinking. I think we'll have this generally low tax, low spending approach for a long time. But I think we might see some changes at the margins to make the investments that you need if you're becoming more of a knowledge economy than a resource economy.
I think with that, we're going to say thanks for coming, Erica.
Thanks for having me.